Good morning, everybody. We're continuing our study in the Sermon on the Mount. We're going to pick up in Matthew chapter 5, beginning verse 38 this morning. Good to see everybody out and about. Just kind of picking up kind of where we've been the last few weeks. In verse 17, we see Jesus is this statement of, hey, I'm not coming here to tear the old law down, to get rid of everything, but really this is not something that will go away, but it is a completeness, is a fulfillment of that. He then, last week, we talked about a lot of that. You have heard it said, so these principles, these laws from the Old Testament that kind of had gotten misapplied or reinterpreted, and really these kind of these almost narrow interpretations or kind of misinterpretations of the law. He says, hey, now I'm calling you into a different way of looking at that, a deeper righteousness that's different than what the scribes and the Pharisees are telling you and how they're living. He's like, I want you to be better than what you see as the religious leaders around you. We then looked at all these kind of, you have heard it said, but I say, and we're going to continue with that kind of concept this morning. The section we're going to look at is Jesus is teaching that righteousness comes from our heart, not a pure outward conformity or kind of like the external behaviors. Yes, I did all the right things maybe, but my heart was kind of away from what God. Jesus is telling us we need to be transformed inwardly. And it's also kind of a contrast probably with, as you would imagine, the religious leaders at the time. Then there's this kind of cultural norms that kind of build all around those types of things. So let's pick up this morning in Matthew chapter 5, beginning with verse 38. You've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. If anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. So an eye for an eye. Sounds. We studied that in the Law of Moses study. Definitely an Old Testament principle. So let's look over in kind of where is this coming from in Exodus chapter 21. The Greek, or maybe Latin, Latin phrase, lex talionis, is really kind of where we see this eye for an eye. So Exodus chapter 21, beginning in verse 23 says, when men strive together and hit a pregnant woman so that her children come out, and there is no harm, the one who has hit her shall surely be fined, as a woman's husband shall impose on him, and he shall pay as the judge determines. But if there is harm, then you shall pay life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, and stripe for stripe. So I think one of the things, though, that I want us to kind of call attention to in this Exodus passage there is in verse 22, right at the end. And he shall pay as the judge determines. Well, kind of keep that in mind as we look at a couple of these passages. So let's turn over to Leviticus chapter 24, look a little bit more kind of what this kind of looks like in practice. Leviticus chapter 24, verse 17. Whoever takes a human life shall surely be put to death. Whoever takes an animal's life shall make it good, life for life. If anyone injures his neighbor as he has done, it shall be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Whatever injury he has given a person shall be given to him. Whoever kills an animal shall make it good, and whoever kills a person shall be put to death. You shall have the same rule for the sojourner and for the native, for I am the Lord your God. And our final passage there in Deuteronomy chapter 19, verses 15 through 21. A single witness shall not suffice against a person for any crime, for any wrong in connection with any offense that he has committed. Only on the evidence of 2 witnesses or of 3 witnesses shall a charge be established. If a malicious witness arises to accuse a person of wrongdoing, then both parties to the dispute shall appear before the Lord, before the priests and the judges who are in office those days. The judges shall inquire diligently, and if the witness is a false witness and he has accused his brother falsely, then you shall do to him as is meant for his brother. So you shall purge the evil from your midst, and the rest shall hear and fear, and shall never again commit any such evil among you. Your eye shall not pity; it shall be life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, and foot for foot. So here we see there the addition, though, that there are multiple witnesses. There are then judges, and those judges are to inquire and prove out that those witnesses are true and make sure that they are actually true witnesses. In verse 17, we also see that the dispute shall appear. Priests and judges appear before the Lord, and then they are executing God's judgment. And ultimately, the purpose of all this eye for eye and things like that was really to kind of deter crime through, hey, there's going to be a penalty for this, all right? That's going to hopefully deter other people from doing bad things in the future. So we see the Old Testament principle is pretty solid, right? There's the purpose, though, was now misguided. So I think we see the purpose of the law is justice is for all. The law was fair. It wasn't biased towards the rich person. We don't see it here as like, hey, if you're rich enough and you can like pay off whoever, no, it's pretty clear. It's an eye for an eye. If you are found guilty, you must pay to the right thing. It's really this idea of we're protecting the vulnerable. It's also the punishment fit the crime. It wasn't like, hey, I bumped into you and knocked you over and you bruised your side, and now the punishment is death. It was very much a punishment fit the crime. So whatever you did, it was to be done to you. And it really kind of instilled an idea of justice. The other thing is, where do we see that the justice was taken part in? This is where the civil authorities took this into their own hands. This wasn't like, hey, you did it to my brother, I'm going to come after you. This was the civil authorities were the people who exacted the justice, who exacted the punishment, not individuals. So this was not about personal revenge. I think we can kind of see that it holds true in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the son of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. So kind of keep that in mind too, as we kind of get a little bit deeper into this progression. We'll see kind of how Jesus then kind of circles us all the way back to that. It's also kind of, you see in the aftermath of the Cain and Abel scenario where, I don't remember who it is. So in Genesis chapter 4, verse 23, it says, I have killed a man for wounding me and a young man for striking me. This idea of this escalation of kind of feuds that can kind of boil over, like you did it, it's like Hatfield-McCoy kind of situation where it's like, hey, you did something to my brother, I'm going to take you out. This was really meant to kind of like, the justice was not about revenge. It was about justice. And finally, it was really to this kind of deter kind of evil behavior. So we see that the principle was still probably accurate. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth was the right thing. So what has gone wrong? Why has things kind of gone off the track? Why is this kind of being called out as something that Jesus needs to correct? I think we can kind of see in the world in the first century that it really became one of lack of justice. It became who you were in terms of standings in with the leaders at that time. Who have you aligned yourself with? And so Jesus brings these kind of 4 illustrations. So let's look back in Matthew chapter 5 again. The first illustration was, do not resist the one who's evil, but if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other one also. That sounds like a lot of fun, right? It is interesting. I'm not sure if I've really kind of captured this in the past in reading that, but it says, if someone strikes you on the right cheek, so wait a second, if I strike somebody, I'm probably going to hit them. If I'm swiping at it with my right hand, I'm going to hit their left cheek. This is probably more like a backhanded swipe. So this is really about, though, an insult probably more so than a pure fisticuffs. But Jesus says, give him your other cheek. Don't bear up and kind of, all right, take this insult as probably more an insult than an assault, but how we respond to it really tells the kind of where our heart is. And we look at how did Jesus respond to these similar things. We see the passages there from Isaiah where it's prophesied that one would come and would be kind of challenged and insulted and spat upon and hit and beaten. And then we see in the Matthew passage there where it came to fruition, where at his arrest and trials, he was beaten, he was mocked, he was spit upon. But I think what we see is Jesus is saying, you need to respond to this insult in a way that probably it'll de-escalate the situation. So how do we do that in our own lives? I think that's the hard question. Because I think in our own lives, when someone insults us, our first response is to fight back. And that's probably where our gut tells us, right, kind of ball our fists and we kind of think about what should I do to get back with them? But Jesus is asking us to have a different path, a different heart, a different way. And this is just the first of these 4 illustrations that I think calls on us to make a change. Ian?
God says in Ezekiel, I don't know what it is, vengeance is mine, says the Lord. So, if somebody does something really bad to you, like murder or whatever, you're not supposed to get offended. You're not supposed to offend them. Let God do the punishment. You're not supposed to do the punishment.
Yep. We're going to get into a little bit more later, too, as we kind of look about how we should love others. Let's turn over to 1 Peter chapter 2 and look at the passage there. This is really talking about our submission towards those who are in authority. But it's interesting in verse 20 through 23. For what credit is it when you sin and are beaten for it, for you endure. But if you are do good and suffer for, but if when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. For this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving for you an example, so that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile it in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. I think the example that we have in Jesus, and how probably none of us are going to come anywhere close to suffering the amount of insult and pain and suffering and things that Jesus ever did. But his example there is saying, hey, don't fight back. Turn the other cheek. A second example here is like, give them your cloak also. So somebody who is suing you for your shirt, give him your coat as well. This is kind of an idea of like, hey, you're probably being kind of abused by the court system. There's some misjustice that's being applied here. Hey, because even in the old law, in the Old Testament, you couldn't even keep somebody's coat overnight. Jesus is like, hey, if you are going under some level of injustice, give them more. Give them all you got to give. Very similarly, we have this go with him 2 miles. So a Roman soldier could compel somebody to, all right, I'm carrying this thing, or you need to do this thing. I can make you go a Roman mile or 1,000 paces. We see the example of Simon of Cyrene, where he is compelled to carry the cross of Jesus to Golgotha. And what Jesus has said, instead of like resenting the fact that I've got to do this thing, he's like, go further. Double it up. Go 2 miles instead. The fourth one here is this: give to the one who begs. I think we can kind of see this is a reflection of our heart. If it's in the right spot, it really reflects God's character. I think this one is the one, as I was looking at this, was like, how many times have I driven up to a stoplight and a guy holding a little cardboard sign, don't have any money, my wife is home with lots of kids, please give me money. And I'm like, running through like, is this a scam? Is this all the things that I can really think about. Am I enabling irresponsibility? Am I rejecting kind of their pathway? But ultimately, should I be so quick to judge? I think that's where I kind of got to yesterday afternoon when I was kind of finishing stuff up. I'm like, Jesus is saying, hey, give to the one who begs. He didn't say, walk them through a survey first of like, let me understand your history and understand what have you done. Are you working? Do you have a job? Blah, 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 blah. It's ultimately too because God gave it all for us. And I think we can see there in Philippians chapter 2, right, where Jesus emptied himself, came down out of heaven and gave everything so that we might be saved. So I think the question there is, so what is, in these 4 things, what is Jesus saying? What is he asking us to do? And kind of where does that then change how we should live? Are these all literal scenarios? Probably not. I've not found myself where I've gotten slapped, but have I found myself where someone has said something against me and I want to kind of quip back with a quick one-liner and like, Have I ever felt some level of injustice where it's a big take? Probably. I think we see there's opportunities where We are compelled to do things that we really wouldn't want to do. But in doing them happily, without resentment, I mean, what influence might that have on others? I think we see there, in all these circumstances, Jesus isn't asking us to like sort out what is fair. He's asking us to show more mercy than we would probably do on our own. He's asking to be joyful, have sacrificial service instead of retaliation, instead of looking at what is right and fair to me. So I think that's where we really need to kind of hone in and say, okay, to me, that gets into, Ian, your question is like, is there ever a time where we can feel justified in getting even? This idea of justice and revenge in our own lives. How do we live our lives in a way that is according to what Jesus is asking them to do today? And what does that look like in my life? How do I live differently? So I kind of want to open up a few questions. When someone insults you or wrongs you, how do we typically respond? Stuart?
So one of the things, just right before that question, the 4 illustrations there, all, I think, were provided for us with God's wisdom to say, hey, all of these are within your control. So you can turn the other cheek, you can give your cloak, you can go 2 miles, you can give to the one who begs. To your point, it doesn't say, hey, we have to judge the situation and decide whether we should or not. But I think one of the things to keep in mind is each of these illustrations are well within our own control and how we respond. We can't control necessarily how someone else behaves. We
Right.
wish that they would not do certain things, but these illustrations demonstrate that in our responses are totally within our ability and control. So I think as we look at it, it is not within our control then to show mercy.
Yep. Mark?
I agree with what Stuart said, they're within our control. I think part of what is going on here is, it's a change of heart, like you've already mentioned it, but before somebody slaps you on the cheek, you need to have already decided what your reaction is going to be. You have to have had a heart change, and you have to have a mindset that when and if this ever happens, here's how I'm going to respond, and that takes a lot of discipline.
I think it's looking at this mindset shift of like always looking to figure out what's mine, what's fair, what's right for me, and flipping that around.
Yeah, and to that point, I don't mean to be too controversial, but I'm like looking at the screen and it's very like against American values. Like our country is built on my rights, my freedoms. Like as soon as we got a constitution, we tacked on a Bill of Rights and said these are the 10 things that no one can ever take from me, and I would fight you before I let you take these rights. And we have to have a totally opposite mindset that says, go ahead. In these situations, you're basically being stepped on, and you say, okay, I'll be merciful. I'm not going to punch back. And so I think just because of the culture that we live in and because of our emphasis on freedom and we can do what we want, it's extra important for us to like keep these principles top of mind.
Ryan?
So I look at this as, Jesus is fulfilling the law. He's trying to instate a new mindset. In the new law, it's all about your heart, your attitude. And I'm tempted to always look at these and like be like, okay, this is the thing I check off. This is what I do. If somebody actually hits me, but like we're touching on,
I think what would happen if we kind of responded in kind? The situation is going to continue to escalate and get worse. We're going to lose our ability to influence others.
It's not a prohibition on any type of response. We're told to be at peace with people as best as we can. A robber is going to come up to you. There may be a limit. He may just want the $20 that's in your wallet. That would be a judgment. Yeah, take the $20. He may be going to kidnap your family and your kid, and your car. Or he may be going, or there's somebody might be going to make you bankrupt. And you don't give him, you don't become destitute and let him drain your bank account and drain your savings.
Sure.
So that you cannot provide for your family. You can take action against him, within the law. Jesus told his disciples, I'm leaving you. You need a couple of swords. You don't need a whole army. You need a couple of swords. Why? To deter the robbers. I don't think the swords were going to be there just to scare the robbers off. They were to use against the robbers if it became necessary to a point where, there's a limit there somewhere. Their lives are in danger or something of that sort. So that's not an absolute prohibition against defending yourself, against not giving everything you own. St. Francis of Assisi, he gave his clothes. He gave everything. It's not going to the extreme.
Absolutely. I think this is one though that I think in I think where we've kind of been all the way to this spot in the Sermon on the Mount is Jesus is teaching us not to just be looking out only for ourselves. I think as you look at the Beatitudes, right? I think there's a lot of be merciful, be poor in spirit. We cannot only get wrapped up, I think, and I think what oftentimes we do is we get wrapped up in what I deserve. I, not others. Instead, though, I think what God is asking us to do is to figure out how can I have a higher level of concern for others around me, and then ultimately be more like God, who is perfect, which really leads us into where Jesus goes next. Verse 43, you have heard it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good. He sends rain on the just and the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? You therefore must be perfect, as your heavenly Father is perfect. So the Old Testament principle here is from Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18, where it says, love your neighbor as yourself. But they kind of somewhere along the lines added this extra part about love your neighbor, hate your enemy. I think it's pretty easy for us to kind of figure out how they kind of got there a little bit. So as the Pharisees had kind of said, all right, God hates evil. Yes, we can see over and over in the Old Testament that God is opposed to evil and hates evil. Those who do evil, therefore, are God's enemies, right? Yes, people who do evil are enemies of God, and God does not like evil. So, therefore, those people are my enemies. They'd kind of even figured out, though, it's like an enemy ends up being everybody that's not like me. So, we got Gentiles. Oh, they're not right with God. They don't have that relationship with God. Therefore, they are not like me. They are my enemies. The Samaritans are not worshiping. They've kind of led their lives away from the way that God. Many limited kind of the way that kind of a neighbor equals only Israelites, fellow Israelites. So this is the Essenes, who is a sect of the Jews. They're kind of out in their own kind of monastery situation and kind of have figured out. This is from their writings. This is Essene 1QS verse 1. And he says, he commanded by the hand of Moses and by all the servants of the prophets that they shall love all that he has chosen and hate all he has rejected. They'd really focused in on, like, you have to be an Israelite to be a neighbor. Everybody else, enemy, and enemies are rejected. And we kind of see Jesus really rejected this. So if you look over in Luke chapter 10, we have the parable of the Good Samaritan. So he really answers, who is my neighbor? And we see in this story this man who is robbed and left for dead. And we see probably a Jew, right? So he's going from Jerusalem to Jericho, probably a Jew. But you have this priest. It's like, I'm not going to, I could defile myself. I might not be able to do my job if I take care of this person. The Levite kind of leaving the same thing. It's like, I could be unclean if I do this. And you have a Samaritan come and take care of this person. So Jesus is like, hey, by the way, this whole idea of a neighbor situation, who is my neighbor, is a little bit more inclusive than. So God's true command is to love. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. When he says love your enemies, what does that conjure up in your mind? Just kind of like, oh, this kind of love, squishy love, kind of. I don't think this is kind of good feeling, but it's really kind of, what is my response? What is my goodwill towards that person and what they're doing? And then he says, oh, by the way, pray for them. How do you pray for your enemies if you don't first check your attitude? I think that's where Jesus, he really kind of hits it hard, this one, I think. It's praying for somebody means you're going to really change your attitude towards that person.
Yeah, I think that as I thought about this, just some cliches where all this comes from. Old law, 2 wrongs don't make a right. New law, kill with kindness. And I think this kill with kindness approach that I feel like is part of what we're talking about here is you can approach that with a very passive aggressive, sarcastic, snarky kindness approach, which doesn't. I think the hard part when praying, there's also a check the box. I'm going to pray for my enemies. That's what I know I'm supposed to do. Versus, no, I really feel it in my heart, and I really have compassion for my enemy. That's a harder step to make sometimes in our prayers.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. He's going to, in the next chapter, we're going to talk about like our attitude, how we should be, our attitude. It can't be like, I'm going to pray for you. God, take care of this person. And we'll see that kind of like, I'm better than them. No, this is really kind of a breaking of our own heart to God and say, hey, we need to work on this.
I was gonna say, I think we have to be careful with this us versus they mentality that you'll see a lot of times in Christian circles, and I'll admit I've been guilty of that myself. And that it's really, we're not, I think of like two kind of like churchy or, I don't know how you want to label them, cliches. One, we really need to hate the sin and not the sinner in terms of this idea of praying for our enemies. And then also, we're not, oh, what was the other one? Sorry. We're not the ones that are supposed to be the judgers. Yes, we're supposed to use discernment, but we're not supposed to run around like we're Holy Ghost Jr., making all the calls and, oh, here's the other one, I just remembered. We may be the only Bible or the only Jesus that someone who is not a believer sees. And so we need to be, really careful of they need to stay on their side of the town or their side of the tracks, and believe me, if you knew how my mind works, I like things typically very black and white and very, okay, it's this way, not that way, and so to embrace this idea, I mean, it's a challenge for me personally, but the older I get, the more I see, or at least I'm hoping that I'm seeing what God and Jesus are trying to teach me and show me, that this is how we're supposed to respond to people, and you can't just, this whole they versus us mentality, I mean, it's really sad because you'll even see it in families.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not talking church families, I'm talking your biological families, and
Yeah.
I
Rob?
mean, you just can't do that.
This concept of loving your enemies and praying for your enemies, I've been in lots of adult classes where adults, and myself included, have made the point that this is one of the hardest things for them to get their arms around. One of the hardest things. I've got to do what? And so, but it's there, and it says it, and we need to embrace it. One of the things I think that helps me in that endeavor is before I pray for somebody who I perceive to be against me or somehow an enemy or somehow opposed to me, it is, I do pray that I have the proper attitude towards this person and that I somehow behave in a way that glorifies God towards this person, not only in my interactions with him, but in my prayer life. I mean, I don't think I can control his actions, but I can control mine, and I should be able to control my attitude. And sometimes I need God's help with that. Before I pray for them, I pray for myself that let me have an attitude that glorifies you and we have the right attitude and try to really fulfill your command on this. And kind of a broader point on this whole section, not only praying for your enemies and loving your enemies, but the whole eye for an eye. You've heard it said this, but I say this. That I think my point would be is this is pretty profound. This is revolutionary. Not only for the time it was written, but even today, people don't embrace this. People don't believe this. Like Adam already said, our society socializes us otherwise. That this whole idea of justice, that the punishment must fit the crime. I mean, this concept of the punishment fitting the crime, eye for an eye, it even predates the law of Moses. Okay, Moses, I think, was born in around 1400. In 1700, Hammurabi, the code, 1700 BC,
Yeah.
we're talking BC, 1700 BC, the code of Hammurabi, it was a Babylonian, came out with this whole concept of an eye for an eye. And so this concept predates even the law of Moses, and for whatever reason, that's really spoken to men, and men have embraced that. Yeah, that makes sense, an eye for an eye. The punishment needs to be meted out according to the offense. But Jesus is saying something profoundly different here.
Yep.
And we need to try to get our arms around that.
I think to your point in the beginning of what you're saying too, I got a quote here about this. It says, it is impossible to pray for somebody without loving him, and impossible to go on praying for him without discovering that our love for him grows and matures. We must not, therefore, wait before praying for an enemy until we feel some love for him. We must begin to pray for him before we are conscious of loving him. And we find ourselves, that love breaks into a bud and finally into a blossom. I think that's the idea. It's like, just do it. Just pray. We've got to start. We got one, ask God to help fix our heart. And there we can kind of, that love can grow and develop.
My thoughts go straight to Romans 12:20, where it says, talking about all this, it quotes from Proverbs, what Paul does. If your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him a drink. For in doing so, you will heap coals of fire upon his head. Then he goes on and says, just so you know, ha ha ha, I'm going to get you because it would be nice to you so that you'll feel bad about yourself. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. And the goal there is to get them to feel guilty for what they do, by showing them love. And that guilt, will hopefully what 2 Corinthians 7:10 does talk about, that it produces godly sorrow, and godly sorrow to repentance, and bring them into the fold as well. And that should be our ultimate goal with all of this stuff that Jesus is talking about here on the Sermon on the Mount, that we get as many people to be followers of Christ because we're different by what we do.
Right. By praying for our enemies, it changes us, but it also changes them. I think we see Jesus did, right? On the cross, he says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Stephen, as he's being stoned, he said, Lord, do not hold this sin against their charge. And I think this higher standard is loving those who love you. That's natural, right? It's easy. But Jesus says, like, hey, we need to love those that don't love us, because that's what drives us and makes us to be children of the Father. It's a higher standard of righteousness, because like, hey, even the tax collectors love the people that love them. We need to be better than that. Be perfect. This challenge then is to be perfect as your Father is perfect. That's a hard standard to run up against, right? I think it's something that, can I be perfect like God? That's what Jesus is asking us to do. I think that's, as we kind of look at the summary of kind of all of chapter 5, I think we see it kind of ends with this kind of call to action at the very end of this section, is like, Jesus again says, hey, I'm not asking you to take away, I'm not coming here to abolish all the old law, but this completion, this fulfillment, this perfection of what God's law would be. I think it's and then he says, hey, by the way, he wants our love to be perfect, completed, full, like God's love for us is. And I think that's where he's asking us to do. Jesus wants our love to be like God's love for us. Full, complete. And he kind of ends it with a period. Stop. A love that looks out for the best interests of others, not only looking out for only ourselves. Eric?
You got to think pretty specifically on what does it mean to love. You know, we tend to go to the example of Stephen and thinking that love means just ignoring it or forgetting about it or brushing it off. If you love somebody, you want them to be right with God. That includes praying for them if they're wrong. You know, I mean, you got to make sure you're not the one that's in the wrong. You got to make sure, you know, that you pray that they will see that they're wrong. You've got to somehow bring it to their attention that they're wrong and try to correct it. So, you know, Stephen's example, I think, is used too much in saying you just ignore what they're doing, and that's loving them. Loving them is not ignoring it any more than you would love your children if they were acting rebellious and you didn't discipline them.
Yeah. I think as we look at the last the last 6 classes that we've seen here, it's in this sermon, Jesus is really introducing a whole different concept. He's saying, hey, you see what's going on in the world around you? Be different. This is what God's nature truly is. Don't be like the Pharisees who kind of like took little pieces of the law and kind of like, this is what we're going to hang our hat on, and we're going to hold you more accountable to this part of the law, but we're kind of forget about some of these other ones. He's asking us to kind of live a life where our personal kind of aspects may be attacked, but he's asking us that, hey, leave justice in an official setting. Revenge has no place in our own lives. God will ultimately be the judge. That's where Ian took us through earlier today. Our role is to act in mercy and grace. We're not to abolish justice, but God wants us to transform our hearts. But in transforming our hearts, it's going to start to help others see that there's a different way. It's going to transform their hearts. Don't limit our love. We need to go beyond what's fair. I think that's a hard one. We need to reflect God's nature, God's infinite love, when we love like he loves, without discrimination, without retaliation. Even though it doesn't feel right, we need to love like he did. Jesus' examples, I think, are kind of hard. They kind of look on the surface like, oh, yeah, sure. That's probably not going to happen to me, but I'm sure there are places and times where we've got to love, we've got to give, we've got to forgive, we've got to endure. Not because the people that are doing things against us deserve us to give them that grace, but because God gave us the grace first when we didn't deserve it. I think in Romans chapter 12 that we need to overcome evil collectively with good. And I think as we kind of end this call to action for us all, therefore be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. We're going to pick up with kind of does it look like in the next class to kind of this devotion. We're going to see about giving, about praying, about fasting. Some of our times we're in our devotion, we can kind of get it upside down and it starts to look a lot more about us than for God. And I think that's what Jesus is kind of asking us to kind of recalibrate what it means to be devoted to him.